Hey, what is going on, guys? It is the SMT. Thanks for tuning in to watch this edition of the channel. Today we're going to take a look at the rise and the demise of Sprint. Really an empire of a telecom at one point. Over 100 years of total success, market growth, and a lot of great things that they did in their time as an operating telecom, and then hitting some really troubling times and some low points, and then now we have a merged component of the new T-Mobile company. We're going to cover everything, what caused the rise and then what caused the demise in today's video. So thank you guys for being here. All of that and those details starts now. Before we get going with today's video, if you could do me a solid, please check out some of the links in the description box. We have links for the SMT Patreon page, $1, $2, and $3 tiers to get you exclusive access and content, things that you will not find anywhere else, live streams, podcasts, exclusive videos, interactions, things of that nature. Got a link there. Also, the second channel, Sneed Mobile Tech live streams, is there. The Twitter handle at Sneed Tech, and Megadon.net. Never need another social media platform ever again. The social media platform of the future. No algorithms, no ads, no tracking. Megadon.net. Really, the content of this video is, why did Sprint fail? Ultimately, the last couple of decades has been an absolute train wreck of operations for this company. They've gone from one of the most influential and successful telecoms in the US, and they've become almost a laughingstock. At least specifically, shareholders and investors never even really looked their way, and in fact, most of the money abandoned the company. Bottom line is, really, Sprint made some really poor decisions over the course of the last couple of decades. For the most part, there were some very expensive disasters from a financial standpoint, failures from the, I guess we'll call it, the network vision decisions that were made by Dan HESSE, and we could also probably throw in the WiMAX issues as well. The names that'll come up in today's video are really Dan HESSE and Gary Forsey. We'll be talking about those two names and what happened during their tenures. For the sake of this video, in terms of why Sprint failed, we're going to focus on 5 major topics, and I'll be listing them and then giving you the breakdown of all those details. To get things started, let's first look at the network decisions and what happened with the network that created basically an incompetence of why the network wasn't up to par and up to the market performance of the other carriers. The issue is the spectrum portfolio. There's not much diversity there. There's not many types of spectrum. There are large concentrations of spectrum in certain types of frequencies, but they don't have the diversity that we see with companies like AT&T and even to a lesser extent Verizon and T-Mobile. A lot of people will be totally honest with you and tell you that Sprint's major concerns and issues over the past couple of decades in their network build out was the fact that they didn't have much low band, and because of that they didn't have great coverage. This is why the network has limited range in a lot of places, and it's why the network had a lot of dead spots. When you don't have much low band and you rely heavily upon mid band and higher frequencies, you need extremely high density when it comes to coverage. So you need a lot of tower sites that are closely packed together. So if you're not using much low band, you basically need more tower sites. With an increased need in site densification, that's going to mean there's going to be a lot of network spending. It's really expensive to build out networks this way because it's expensive to build tower sites. Even renting can be expensive in terms of renting space on tower sites that are pre-existing. But owning, operating, and building is a whole nother story. That costs millions and millions and millions and billions and millions of dollars. Sprint does have a lot of mid-band. To be totally honest with you, more than sufficient amounts of mid-band. They've got lots of PCS spectrum in the 1900 megahertz range. They also have lots of 2500 megahertz, the 2.5 gigahertz, but obviously that type of mid-band is really good for speed and capacity, but it does have its limitation in range and coverage. To give you guys an idea of the limitation of the spectrum operations that they had, band 26, which is Sprint's low band for LTE, is the 850 megahertz variety, and it only utilizes about, or I should say, only 17% of the network traffic for data is completed over this holding. Band 41 or 2.5 gigahertz operates about 50% of the network traffic, so a lot of heavy lifting done on that band. Band 25 spectrum, which is their 1900 megahertz, That's about 32% of the data's network traffic. Of course, you guys could correct me in the comment section. I believe that Sprint's low band concentration holdings had it about 10 to 15 megahertz nationally. That's not very much. Their mid-band, however, is somewhere between like 150 and 160 megahertz of mid-band. So they're doing great things when it comes to 2.5 in their mid-band. But again, like I said, when you're focusing on mid-band and that's really what you hold, you're going to need a lot of tower sites. Let's go ahead and let's transition away from the network specifically, and let's look at some of Sprint's really bad investments. The Nextel acquisition was horrible. This really may be one of the contributing issues and the demise of the company. We'll talk a little bit about the IDEN technology that came with the Nextel acquisition. Never really panned out or worked out for Sprint on any measurable level. The other piece of this is their issue and what happened with WiMAX. It did not work out for them. Like I've said in previous videos and live streams, this completely backfired and set back Sprint several years. Sprint also kind of deserted the landline operations. At least a lot of people speculate that they could have did more with this, or at least squeezed more usage out of it and more money. And the other piece to it, a lot of people claim that the Clearwire acquisition was a failure as well. Bad management, and we'll start first with Dan Hesse. And with Dan Hesse, in terms of management and leadership, he may not be the worst CEO in Sprint's history, but things didn't work out while he was there. He did a couple of good things, but there were some major issues that he was a part of. He kind of did inherit a somewhat failure of a company from his predecessor, and I'll get to that shortly. Dan Hesse gets credit for two failures. He gets credit for the Clearwire debacle, and he also gets credit for the WiMAX failure. He did do some good things though, like he was a big proponent of customer care. He wanted to change the company on that side. In fact, the performance metrics in customer care was its highest ever in Sprint's history. So he does get credit for that. Also, he did try to improve product offerings. He did kind of transform their prepaid segment, and he did a lot with the iPhones during the time of the iPhone era. He did fix some things within the company and some things that were helpful, but it just seemed like maybe it was too much to overcome, and it was overbearing. And then, of course, in the middle of his kind of tenure, Sprint was going to be purchased. It's, what we currently see with SoftBank as the buyer and the operator. That's kind of what was going on at that time. This is where we get to the transitioning over to the SoftBank era with Marcelo as the CEO. You could clearly tell that SoftBank had no idea what they were getting themselves into. United States telecommunications, I don't think they're ready, and I don't think they really understood or grasped the serious nature of how fierce this market was. From very early onset in the purchase and the operation, SoftBank was looking to get out. In fact, a lot of people were speculating that within the first couple of years, SoftBank was looking to sell the company, and they were looking to sell to a big cable operator right off the rip for the most part. Anytime you come into an investment and you've kind of got 1 foot in and 1 foot out, you're going to be kind of haphazard about the whole thing, and you're never really going to try your best to really make it work. And because you're not all in, you never really buy in. And I think that was the situation with SoftBank, and I think also specifically Marcelo, because when your chain of command from the very top shows deficiencies, it's going to trickle down and it's going to be felt throughout the company. This is probably why one of the things that made T-Mobile such a successful company over the last decade while Sprint was failing. T-Mobile was thriving because their CEO and the people working for them believed in the vision of the company. During the SoftBank era, we also saw a lack of investment. People stopped believing in the company and they stopped putting money into it. In terms of investment, people just weren't ready to sink their teeth in and help the company out. So when the company needed the investment, they couldn't get it. For this reason, the network didn't get the investment it needed, and they started to lag behind in LTE build out and coverage. It's also part of the reason why they fell behind in overall technology. So when the market was advancing, Sprint was pretty much lagging behind. Let's talk a little bit about this guy named Gary Forsey. Gary Forsey is probably the reason why Sprint is in its current condition, and it pretty much had to be involved in some form of a merger. Gary Forsey came to the company back in 2005, and he was the driving force behind the Nextel purchase and acquisition. Gary Forsey gets the credit for this absolute debacle and failure and the inability to transition the companies and integrate them together. Sprint's current infrastructure and what they had in technology was completely incompatible with what Nextel brought to the table. The synergies between the two companies just didn't work. The compatibility wasn't there, and it made things really, really difficult, and it just did not happen for Sprint. They had to operate those different technologies independently and separately of one another, and during this time, because the integration wasn't there, customers were starting to flee the company, so they were losing market share, they were losing revenue, and you can also see that because of those incompatibilities, hardware became an issue, and this was very inconvenient for customers. The WiMAX stuff started to get its origins, and this is where that failure started to happen. So, you know, after about 2 years, Gary Forsey was actually fired, and he was shown the door, and I can't be mad at Sprint. During Gary Forsey's tenure, Sprint lost 5 million customers. That is incredible. We covered network stuff, we covered bad investments and bad management. Let's take a look now at branding. This is an interesting angle. A lot of people may not include this in such a video as I am, but I think this is important because this is how the market perceives you, and this is what customers think of you. Sprint recently took on this attitude that our network is good enough. All networks are the same, and that is extremely disingenuous and false. United States telecoms and operators distinguish themselves. They sell their network. They distinguish each other's businesses by saying, our network is the best. Our network has the most LTE. Our network has the fastest speeds. We've got the best 5G, the most 5G. They separate each other from these, you know, with these characteristics as companies. And through all of those different failures and mishaps and miscues, there was never this Un-carrier type moment, this new identification, this resurrection of the company. So what T-Mobile did when they resurrected the company in 2012 and 13 with John Legere, Sprint never had that. So they never successfully rebranded. What this did is it created this bargain brand image about Sprint, which means they couldn't sell their service as high as the other carriers. So they couldn't generate the ARPU. They didn't have the profitability because they were known as this bargain brand. So they went from being the worst network and publicly kind of knowing that, and then saying, well, hey, at least we're the cheapest, come get a good deal at Sprint. For that entire decade, their focus was really prepaid. The problem with that is those customers are not the most profitable. So you can't build out a network, you can't expand the network, which is very costly and expensive, simply focusing on prepaid customers. That's good for an MVNO, that is not good for an MNO. And through all of this that I just covered so far in the video, investors were out. They were pulling their money, they were getting out of the company, nothing was coming back in. The revenue that Sprint was generating just wasn't going to be able to cut it, and it won't generate enough money to sink back into the company. Let's focus now on customer care. This is something that Sprint has a not a good track record with. The systems that Sprint used for their customer care has never really been effective. Whatever model they have in place, it was just never enough to convince customers to stay. So many customers were getting disgruntled. They were not happy with the customer care. Problems were not being resolved. Whatever Sprint has been doing for the last 10 or 15 years has not really worked out long term. I will say that under Dan HESSE, things were better. Things were, I think, in my estimation, they were tolerable at the least. In fact, a lot of metrics were saying that the HESSE era had some of the best performances of customer care in Sprint's history. But safe to say, based on the feedback from, you know, my viewers and the commenters in my videos, in-store reps were not always the most highly trained. They never received probably enough training for all the problems that customers would come across. And I also think that they never really did a full and complete justice type of job to inform consumers about the devices they were buying, their commitments to the company and following through on their payments, different types of, you know, prepaid MasterCards that were given out as rebates on phone, types of credits and contract things. You know, a lot of that was going on for an extended period of time without resolution. Let's talk about poor execution. A lot of times with companies, maybe you don't agree initially with where a company wants to go and what they want to do, but if it's executed correctly, if the management believes in it and there's follow through and there's a good plan and it's executed well, the plan can often work. Even if in the initial stages, it may not seem like it's going to work. So let's take a look at what they did not execute correctly and they did not do right. Let's start with the network piece, the 2.5, right? The 2.5 gigahertz. That is not even close to being remotely done. The upgraded sites are not even close to being complete, and it needs to be deployed on a grand scale. Recently, there's been an enormous lack of spending, and that's because the company does not operate with high profits. They've been giving away stuff, and I'll talk more about that later. They haven't been generating enough revenue on an average revenue per user basis, and they just needed more money, and the investment has not been there because of the previous performances. They're behind in LTE availability. They've relied heavily upon roaming agreements. We've seen that. They've needed Verizon's for calling. They've needed T-Mobile's for data. And obviously, you're limited in how fast the network can be and what you could do with your phone if you are roaming. And sometimes people are getting charged for this roaming. And let's also throw in the fact that, relying on CDMA at this day and age is probably not a good look for the company. WiMAX, WTF to that. WiMAX was a complete and utter failure. When the entire market turned right, Sprint turned left, and they tried to sink their teeth into the WiMAX effort. Nextel, Nextel customers left. They fled the company. IDEN technology was pretty much abandoned, and it was never either resurrected or truly capitalized upon. I think I'll also say that because they couldn't integrate the networks collectively, that was pretty much a failure. They also built and stockpiled debt throughout all of these years, especially the last 15 or so years. So Nextel, Network Vision, WiMAX, these things just compiled on top of each other. Network Vision, it was supposed to be this cost-effective method to building out and integrating a network. You had to take multiple network types and make them work together. New and legacy tech, this is never easy to do, especially when you're kind of bringing together different bits and pieces of network technologies from other companies. And of course, this was what HESSE's true failure was. 800 megahertz spectrum, 1.9 gigahertz spectrum, 2.5 gigahertz spectrum. He had all these assets at his disposal, but it never quite worked out. There was a lot of money put into this, and it just didn't work. Think also CDMA, think LTE, think about the WiMAX. He tried with the push-to-talk features. This was in limited markets. This was in limited application. Just thinking back to what was going on in the Sprint and Nextel era, none of this just ever really worked out for Sprint. And people don't talk about this enough. But the actual network teams that were put into place that were designed to integrate and make these networks work and talk to each other, these network teams were horribly incompatible. People were not on the same page. The vision was not shared and agreed upon, and I don't think people really believed in the vision of the company, in the people that were working together. If there's no team vision, they can't move forward together. You start to kind of see a divisiveness to the company. I never really think they believed in what they were doing. I'm going to go ahead and throw in some bonus stuff for you guys to think about and what was going on with Sprint through all these years. Over the course of the last 5 to 10 years, there's several things that Sprint has not had or has had on a very limited basis. To give you guys some examples, Wi-Fi calling, Sprint was last to that, I believe. If not last, they were very late to it. I can say HD calling has not been a strong suit of them. A lot of people complain about the calling quality, and we also know that their voice over LTE is still to this day limited to certain phones in certain markets. I don't really understand how this could be happening at this point because, pretty much every major telecom has had this for several years. In-store reps and how they may have been undertrained or not fully trained for all the things that could happen in the store, but also call centers and customer care over the phone, they have never been consistent, and that's something that I think a lot of people underrate in terms of customer care. The phone compatibility issues has always been atrocious. This is a customer pain point when they're trying to activate a phone that they previously owned with another company that's been, even if it's been unlocked, it's been a nightmare trying to get phones activated, and the activation policies and procedures are just awful. You think about how this would be a customer inconvenience. You just want to put a SIM card into a phone and they don't allow you to do that. There's also been this ongoing perception of people that Sprint's really more of a regional carrier. Nationally, they don't have a self-sustaining network. I don't care what anybody says. If you don't have sufficient low band and you don't have densification throughout the country, you can't be taken seriously as a national carrier. And this is something that Sprint has been facing for a long time. You cannot convince me that the Sprint network has the national coverage of Verizon or even AT&T. So that's pretty much the end of that. Other stuff like billing credits and billing systems, it was really a nightmare. I've heard, horrible stories about customers complaining about what happened with their bill and how, customer care didn't fix their issues. I remember when Sprint was just giving out lines to help sustain life at the company, losing and hemorrhaging customers, basically bleeding out customers. And in the effort to stop this bleeding, they're basically just giving away free lines. We saw that with the Kickstart. You basically just had to pay taxes. You could buy 2 lines and get 3 free. This is an unsustainable way to do business. It's just no way to operate when you think about ARPU. You're not making money on customers if you're just giving away free access. If you're gonna, have maintenance and repairs and build outs and network advancements and getting with the times and getting with the competition, you can't give away a bunch of free stuff. They probably should have gone GSM a long time ago, just for the sake of, you've got this proven concept of it working. Not to say that CDMA wasn't working at the time, but it was a global standard. Everybody was using GSM. Why didn't they just go that way? At least at the time, it would have made more sense, thinking, what are we going to do with our network for the time being? And over the last decade, while all this transitioning was going on to LTE, Sprint heavily relied upon their CDMA, and you just can't transmit much data, and you can't, offer any type of throughput network traffic through CDMA. It was going LTE, and Sprint just didn't have it. A lot of you are probably thinking, wow, this video is super negative. Like, why would you just sit here and dog Sprint through all these different things that they went through? The truth of the matter is, this was all self-inflicted wounds. This was death by 1,000 cuts. I've heard that saying many times with Sprint. It was many things compounded over years and years of, just missed opportunities, chances to backtrack and correct issues, and they were just never able to do it. And this is why they had to merge with T-Mobile. If they didn't merge with T-Mobile, they were going to have to merge with somebody else. If they didn't merge with somebody else, they may have gone bankrupt. If they didn't go bankrupt, they needed a bailout. There were just too many scenarios where they were just so far under, they were not going to be sustainable in the future when it comes to business operations. So there we go. It's basically a video about why Sprint had to merge. They were a business failure on so many different levels that extended over the course of 2 or 3 different decades. You guys let me know in the comment section what you think Sprint's biggest blunder was. What do you think was their worst mistake? And if there's anything you agree or disagree with me, or things that you experienced through these years as a Sprint customer, maybe you were with them, maybe you stayed with them, maybe you left them, tell me all about your experiences with Sprint. I want to thank you all for being here to watch this video. Thank you so much for taking the opportunity to do so. If you like this video and you appreciate the content, please by all means do hit that like button and consider sharing it to your favorite social media platforms. That helps me out tremendously. And maybe this is your first time here and you want to hang around and become a part of the community, hit that subscribe button and make sure you activate that notification bell icon so you never miss an upload from the SMT. If you're not ready to leave the channel and you want to check out some other videos, I've hand selected a few. I put one there, and there. You guys can check those out. That would be amazing. Thank you so much for that. That wraps up this video. Thank you all again for being here and watching. I am the SMT and we will catch you guys on the next video. Peace.